Hello everyone. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Thoughtfuel. If you saw last week's episode, we talked about why I recommend we take the time to modularize an Android application and why it's worth your investment. This week we're going to talk about what I call the dividing line, and that's when we take the time to do that. And I didn't really go into detail about that last time, but this time we're going to go into 5 different reasons whenever I think we cross that line and it's worth the investment to modularize. So let's get started. Just so that we all have a common frame of reference, I usually like to refer to an application that we can just download and try out on our phones. So for this example, I'm going to use Microsoft Outlook, and I think it fits this topic pretty well. Now, some of this is going to be speculation because obviously I've never seen the source code for Microsoft Outlook on Android, but we can use it as a thought experiment nonetheless. So if you download it, or if you've ever seen somebody else use it before, once you set up your account, there are 3 tabs that you're presented with as soon as you launch the application. And the first one on the left is going to be default. We could think of this as being perhaps its own module or its own feature because it deals with everything with email. You have your inbox, sent items, deleted items, as well as composing a message. And to me, that fits very well into the idea of a standalone feature. If we go to the next tab, you have contacts, and everything related to that is taken care of inside of that tab. That could be feature number 2. For feature number 3, then finally you have calendar. And once again, everything related to calendar is inside of there. So we could have that being its own module. So by and large, if we looked at the source code for Microsoft Outlook on Android, you may have 3 distinct modules for 3 distinct features. That's an excellent lead-in for the very first condition that I consider whenever it comes time to modularize an application, and that is when you have your own standalone feature. Now, whenever I think about an app with a bunch of different modules inside of it, I would want those modules to reflect the structure of the application. So that way, whenever I open up the project for the first time, I take a look at the project panel in Android Studio, I can see all of the different modules and all of the different features that are inside the application. That way, I get a 5,000-foot view of what's going on before I even dive into the source code. So not only does it make it easier for you at a quick glance, but it also makes it easier for the compiler. This is something that I mentioned in the previous video. Your compiler can take each of those features, build them in parallel, and then when it's time to put them together, it can zip them up. Really, it reduces your build times. So not only is it easier for you, it's easier for your compiler. When it comes time to creating a new feature, another thing I consider is if each of the features are fairly standalone, meaning that feature A and feature B won't have a lot of shared dependencies in common on each other. Let's go back to the Microsoft Outlook example, for instance. Now, if I go to the Mail tab and I say I'd like to compose a new email, if I start typing an email address into the To field, I'll probably get a couple suggestions that I could also find in the Contacts tab, which makes perfect sense. So that means that the wall between, say, feature A and feature B isn't necessarily going to be a brick wall that you can't penetrate, but by and large, functionally, they're very separate. If you do have some things that you need to share in common between feature A and feature B, a lot of times I'd recommend just putting it inside of a shared module. That way you can start piping those dependencies through the shared module, or you could have the shared module inject its own dependencies into feature A and feature B. When we take the time to define things like this, we definitely need a lower bound. So in this case, if you have a feature that's, say, 1 or 2 screens, I wouldn't even bother breaking it out into its own module. I would just put it into either the app module or another existing feature module at this point. It's not worth your effort to take the time for just 1 or 2 screens. So I always say if you have 3 screens or more, then it's worth the effort. The fourth thing I like to consider is more of an engineering design decision, and that is whenever your feature has a single entry point, then this is another great candidate for modularization. And the way I think about this is, let's say you have a feature, and every time that you launch that feature, you're always going to land on the same home page or the same start page for that feature. Instead of having 1, 2, or 3 different entry points, it really is easier if you can get that inside of one entry point. Let's take Microsoft Outlook, for example. Whenever you get a brand new email, generally you'll get it as a notification, right? So if you tap on that notification and it opens up your email client, it would make sense that it would go straight to that inbox message for you, right? So the way this would probably work is you're actually landing on the inbox feature, and then it takes you immediately to the details. So even though the user isn't really seeing the inbox because it quickly transitions to the details, you're still landing on the inbox screen first, then into the details. So that way when you hit the back button, you're right on the inbox, you're right on the landing page of the feature. Things like that are pretty easy to work with. The fifth considering factor that I like to think about is sometimes more of a matter of personal preference. Let's say you have a library or an API or some other bit of code that you really would like to get out of the way. Sometimes putting that in its own module is a great way of doing that. Now, I'm not talking about like a junk drawer module where everything that you don't want to see goes inside of it, but if you have a bunch of related code that is either too complicated or too big to work with and you really would like to just work with a subset of it, all you need to do is wrap those APIs, expose those APIs inside of your own module, and suddenly you don't have to work with all of the other noise in the library. You can work with just the part of it that you exposed. That's another great time to consider modularizing. Even if it's not its own feature or a screen the user's ever going to see, it's definitely going to make your job easier.